From inflation to national security to lackluster leadership, Americans have many concerns about the direction of our country. Instead of addressing these issues, politicians in Washington have been passing the blame to America's economic leaders, such as the tech industry. Their solution is to put big government in charge, attacking our own, while our global competitors like Europe and China close the gap. Conservatives must stop progressives from causing more inflation with more red tape and bigger government. Join us in telling our representatives to oppose a radical antitrust agenda at netchoice.org/2992. That's netchoice.org/2992. This message brought to you by NetChoice.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Capitol Record, and you are in for a treat today if you are one of the very wonderful people who listen to not only the Capitol Record, but also my political podcast, Radio Free California, both of which are hosted here at National Review. But Radio Free California was actually my first baby. It was the podcast I started doing first. I also host a weekly investment podcast called Dividend Cafe that's unrelated to National Review. If you haven't ever checked out Dividend Cafe, do that. But Radio Free California is co-hosted by a friend of mine who serves as the president of the California Policy Center. And we really didn't know each other very well when we started doing the podcast. We had met, had some interaction, but we kind of developed our friendship through the podcast. And now I believe we're going on 5 years plus in doing the podcast, coming up on 6. And the person I'm referring to is named Will Swaim. And he is my guest on Capitol Record today, and I'm going to explain why in a moment. When I say that he is the co-host of Radio Free California, it's not totally fair. It's more like he's the host, and I show up and talk to him every week. Will puts a lot of work into preparing and setting things up. He prepares our agenda, our topics, finds articles, does research, all the things that someone with nothing better to do in their life would do. and we have a lot of fun together, and we're very proud of our listenership and always, trying to expand it and share good things and impact people's thinking through the podcast, which really strives to critically evaluate the state of the Golden State, as we say, California, but found a lot of national listeners because there's so much in what California does that serves as a model to the rest of the country. And in most cases, we mean that in a negative sense. They're negatively modeling different bad things for the country. So that's what Radio Free California is all about. Well, I started Capitol Record because I am an economic guy. This is my passion. I actually do care about economics significantly more than I care about politics. And of course, this need in our present time that I talk about every week here at Capitol Record to defend free enterprise, to defend the concept of capital markets towards the aim of a free and virtuous society is the goal of this podcast. And I've had a lot of people who've been guests here on Capitol Record that have been somewhat affiliated with the Acton Institute. And Acton Institute is where I stole the language of a free and virtuous society. It's nomenclature that it finds its roots in everyone from Burke to Smith to Aquinas to Aristotle, for that matter. But the specific use of the term and coinage thereabouts is from Father Robert Sirico of the Acton Institute. And so we've had a number of their fellows and writers and lecturers and whatnot on the podcast. And Will Swaim and I just returned, in Will's case, minutes ago, in my case, hours ago, from a week at the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I have gone for, I believe, either 12 or 13 years now and been a lecturer for 10 of those. And Will, I believe this is your third time going?
That's right. Yeah, third.
And so I thought, okay, let's have Will come on Capitol Record so we can cross-pollinate these podcasts, allow me to be in the big boy chair and have Will be the one I'm interviewing, and yet we can share all of the majesty of what we just took away from this week at Acton Institute, germane to the topic of free enterprise. Will, welcome to Capitol Record.
Thank you, David. Good to be here.
What does bienvenidos mean again?
It's California for welcome. It's Spanish for welcome.
Okay, so bienvenidos.
Thank you. Gracias.
As we say in Manhattan, what do you want?
I thought that was a serious question. I don't know, man.
Yeah. Will, tell people, in all seriousness, what it was like the first time you went to Acton Institute. What was that episode like? Why is that important? Why would listeners care? This will require you to share a bit of your background and then where your first trip to Acton led you.
Well, we've never really discussed your purpose in recruiting me to go that first time. I think it was 2017. And I have since come to the conclusion, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I've since come to the conclusion that you identified the lack of formal training in, I'll say in the classics, that I was still carrying some of the vestigial stuff of my Marxist orientation from back in the 70s and 80s. And so we can talk about that later if you'd like. But when I arrived at the Acton Institute, I was immediately taken by a couple of sessions led by a guy whose name is Kishore Jabalayan. He's an economist. He was an economist and a philosopher, a guy who really, really knows these things quite deeply, who turned me on to Michael Novak. And particularly Novak's, I think, just amazing critique of liberation theology. And the name of that book, if I remember correctly, I've got it over here on the bookshelf, is Will It Liberate? I've now read it twice. And, I was one of those people, raised Catholic in South Orange County, went to Catholic schools. Then I went to USC, fight on. And it was there that I think in order to distinguish myself, to make myself unique, but also because there's a logical error that happens. I think you go to college, you've been sort of kept in the stew pot of Catholicism and conservatism your whole life, and then you're presented with all kinds of new ideas. And one of the shiny ideas was that my Catholic theology was right fundamentally, but wrong in its contemporary orientation, and that I had to really understand that Jesus came with a preference to support not just the poor in spirit or the meek or the humble, but to support a kind of class warfare that would lead ultimately to a socialist utopia in which people sat around and considered the Bible in the context of their grinding poverty in the third world. And in 1978, 79, 80, Reagan comes into office, and really in 81, it was hard not to see the attractiveness of that model because we had wars raging in Central America. The Reagan administration was very much into curbing the rising tide of armed communist revolutionaries in places like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, or as my friends used to say, Nicaragua. And I fell into that. And I really mean like I fell, like I kind of just became unglued. And then finding that wasn't sharp enough or pointy enough, I got into Marxism and I joined the Communist Party USA probably 1979, 1980. And that flirtation with the Communist Party lasted somewhat briefly, I got to say. But the Marxism stayed with me. So flash forward, and I become the editor of a very lefty newspaper out here. Some of your listeners may recall like the Village Voice in New York, which in its heyday was this flagship of the alternative media in America, kind of, I would say, ahead of magazines like The Nation, Progressive, Mother Jones, for those who remember those publications or know them well. And so I go to work for a paper out here called OC Weekly. We started it in 95. And as a result of the investigative reporting by my own lefty staff, I began to see holes in my own logic. I began to see that all the government programs that I had so endorsed, the labor movement, just unbridled labor organizing that I had done as well, that all of this stuff had actually immiserated the poor. It did not work. But I didn't completely overthrow all my ideas. I still had this sense that a more kind of liberal, big D Democrat kind of government, sensibly reined in and appropriately skeptical of the Soviet and Chinese models, much more like kind of Bernie Sanders affection. Well, Bernie loved Moscow, never mind. But I'm, more Scandinavian in its orientation. And even that didn't seem to work. I even watched here in Orange County. You remember this, David, back in the 90s, you get a bunch of Republicans running the county board of supervisors out here. And they run the county in 1994 into the greatest municipal bankruptcy in American history to that point. They blew, I want to say, nearly $2 billion. And that catastrophe taught me, I think, not that Republicans are bad, but that even Republicans are people. And when people get into power and they don't have anybody cross-checking them, they can get wound up around the axle of big government programs too. So I go to Acton, flash forward to 2017, and I'm sitting there listening to Kishore Jabalayan, and I started to really kind of nail down the holes in my own education, got exposed to, like Hayek and von Mises. It was mind-blowing in the best sense of the word. Like I could just feel a lot of the old artifice crumbling. So it was a very liberating experience. And then, I went the following year, same thing. The newness had not yet worn off. I went again. I was interrupted, as we all were. COVID interrupted us for a couple of years there, and then went back this year with you. And it had the same effect on me then. This last week was, again, just so remarkable. And I think it's because of, Acton has this, and maybe your listeners already know this, so I apologize if I'm treading over the same territory. You had Father Sirico on, so I'm sure a lot of your listeners already know this, but it's that intersection of, I guess I'll say, faith and economics. Like the thing that really struck me this time was they give you a little tote bag. I'd never gotten a tote bag before from the Acton Institute, and it says right on the bag, David, did you get one? The red bag, and it has a picture of Lord Acton, and it says connecting good intentions with sound economics. And I haven't heard a better summary of what that week is about than that one, because I think we share, you and I, with the left, a concern about the poor. But that good intention is not enough to explain away doing things that are actually hazardous to the poor. And what's the Hippocratic Oath? The first rule is first do no harm. I was into doing loads of harm. I thought I knew better. So, Hayek's knowledge problem in my face, and again, even this week, and I just had a wonderful time.
So let me tell you the answer to your question, because I think you're only partially correct about why I really wanted you to go to Acton initially 5 years ago. There are a lot of people I think should go to Acton because they maybe do not have a fully formed worldview, or they could use a little intellectual cohesion. There are people that maybe have a good impulse on markets and need something more than an impulse, and Acton can help fill that in lectures and writings, and there's something that could be really useful. I think there's some people too, it's just a week of fellowship. Like, it's just so fun to be around like-minded people who are bright, who are intellectually curious. There can be vigorous debate. It is not remotely monolithic politically, and it's really not even monolithic economically. There is plenty of Austrians in Chicago school. There's supply-siders. There's a religious and economic and certainly political diversity. There's a lot of things I think are great about it. But see, in your case, it was not merely that I said, okay, well, Will's a former Marxist and now he's kind of on the right, but he's missing some things. Let's send him out to Acton to kind of get him fully trained. There's a little bit of that. But it was mostly that I rightly identified that the reason you had been attracted to the left was that you cared about the human person. And it was, unlike most people, your conversion was not from being a left-wing softy to being a right-wing a-hole. You didn't go through the Randian path, right?
Right.
So therefore, it was almost like I owed it to you, or someone owed it to you, to see that your frustrations with the left were not merely because they were not being effective. It was not merely like, in other words, the left has the right intentions but gets the wrong results, but the right has the wrong intentions but gets the right results. That's not my view. I wanted to show the right intentions that come from a properly ordered understanding of human liberty. And out of the right intentions, what can be the right results that come from a free and virtuous society and the vision thereof. And so I think the people who should go to Acton are the people that were Marxist. The folks that saw that they got mugged by reality, as Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz and other genius intellectuals of the conservative right that were themselves, like you, a former progressive in a sense. And so it was your Marxian impulse was what I liked. Now, everything about it, I think, is dangerous. Everything about it, I think, is wrong in premise and conclusion. But the reason some American college students found a intellectual or moral appeal in liberation theology, in the Sandinistas, in what brought Bernie Sanders was not Moscow originally; it was Cuba. He was interested in what Fidel was doing. He thought it looked good to solve for poverty via the way in which Fidel controlled the means of production. And so the intention, though, was poverty alleviation. Well, who cares about poverty alleviation? Either a Pharisee and a pietist and a virtue signaling liar, and I knew you weren't any of those things, or someone who cares about the human person. Well, if someone cares about the human person, now the next step is, okay, you're in a journey, you're searching, you've looked at different political things, you've been all over the map, you found a place, you're thoughtful, you're a good writer, you have a history, you have a future. By the way, there's a philosophical foundation that I believe you deserve to hear. And that was why I wanted you to come to Acton. And the people that I have been a part of bringing to Acton over the years, that's what it essentially comes down to, is people that I think have the heart and then need the mind. And I hope that it does sound as if that's been a part of your experience so far.
Yeah, it is. There's a way in which people have pointed out to me that I'm just kind of the classic. Is it Churchill? I don't know if this is apocryphal. Churchill. I mean, this everybody knows the idea. If you're not if you're not a liberal at 20, you have no heart. That one, and not a conservative by 40.
If you're young and conservative, you have no heart. If you're old and liberal, you have no brain.
That's right. So people have pointed that out, and I'm not averse to that. There are certain things that come along with having children and paying a mortgage and paying taxes and running a business that are likely to. That's the reality that mugs you to some extent. Sometimes that, and the failure of every political initiative that you've backed, absolutely crumbling in the face of human nature and natural law. So there's that. And it's also true that, I was probably protected from the Randianism, first because I read Rand like so many people when I was still in high school. I started reading, and I found her repellent, mostly because of her take on religiosity as something archaic. And I can remember there's some line maybe in The Virtue of Selfishness, or her essays on objectivism, as she called it, in which she describes religion as primitives scratching out a living in the dirt or something like that. It was really condescending and showed, almost a willful ignorance of what faith is. And so I was just put off by that. But then, more important, it was people who were self-identified as conservatives who were so crass. And, as you describe them as a-holes, people of a certain age will remember people like Bob Dannemeyer. I think that was his first name, right? Bob Dannemeyer. And then Bob Dornan, B1 Bob. Bill, thank you. Yes. And, Bill Dannemeyer, who famously said that we had nothing to apologize for in the internment of Japanese, and that we should then reopen the camps and put, people with AIDS in them. Bob Dornan, who, referred to a woman running against him as a lesbian spear chucker. Not sure what spear chucker meant in that context, but it had a kind of a racist note. People who really were not just against illegal immigration, but seemed avowedly racist. And
so did those things only color your view of the political right, or did they also leave a bad taste in your mouth about market orthodoxy?
both, yes. I assumed
Because I
that.
kind of think it was fair, the first one, maybe less so the second, but those guys were not great ambassadors for Reaganite vision of politics.
That's right. And so, I try to be sensitive now to the fact that when I describe myself as conservative, or what does Charlie Cook call it, conservatarian, I'm very much a free market advocate. And as you said, there's a big tent in conservatism. And I'm one of those people who's more forgiving of some things than other conservatives are, socially, let's say. We can discuss that if you'd like sometime. I mean, you know it well because we've talked about it on the show, but I, I just really think that when we identify ourselves, if you identify yourself as anything, like I'm a Catholic or I'm a progressive, one has to be aware that other people are going to look to you to find out what's wrong with the model behind you that you've embraced, if that makes any sense. Alcoholics Anonymous is pretty wonderful in saying that you don't go out and promote yourself as a member of a 12-step program. They talk about anonymity that at the level of press, radio, and films. And I think that's a really good principle for people engaged in politics. And certainly I would admonish people on our side to consider the possibility that when you run around talking about yourself as a conservative who loves America, that people are going to judge philosophy unfairly. They're going to judge an entire movement by my actions. And I am so imperfect, and I recognize that we all are. It's just part of human nature. But I'm so imperfect that I know that people do jump on me if I say something that they don't like, and then they twist it maliciously, perhaps. So I try to be careful about that. But and partly because I watched Bob Dornan really just peel away voters from the Republican Party. I don't want to say something on your show that's going to have you in hot water with your listeners, but I think the same thing is true when I hear people, talk about Donald Trump, who I consider neither a conservative nor a Christian. And that doesn't make him a bad person or a bad president, but I'm just really nervous about that sort of thing. Does that make any sense, David?
Well, yeah, no, it does. And I actually think I feel that it's a little easier on the conservative side, because what a conservative is someone who says they think a certain way and says they believe in certain policy prescription. It's a little bit more objective. And I'm a little bit more hesitant to be able to say whether or not someone's a Christian or not, even though, that you would think it's even easier because of the fruits of one's life. But if someone were to say, well, Trump did a lot of bad things, but he's now repented and is a Christian, I could say, I don't know, he doesn't really act like it. He does this, does that. But I mean, if Donald Trump professes to be a Christian, I hope it's true. What I do know is he has never really professed to be a conservative. Now, he did some tremendously conservative things, some by accident and some on purpose. And I'm grateful for those things. But I think you're right that you want people to represent, if they're going to be in a leadership position ideologically in a political party or in a church or whatnot, you want them to embody something that you can get behind. And it's tough to do when the people exhibit bad behavior.
Yeah.
And so I think that's entirely appropriate. I think, like with Ayn Rand, I didn't know her personally. I know a lot of things about her, and we could sit here and talk about the bad things of various people that have held different views over the years. But the thing about Rand that you really have to appreciate is Ayn Rand did not say look, we all need to care for one another. And then she went on and acted selfishly. She said that selfishness was the highest virtue, and that the real definition of virtue was being worthy of love. And I watched the video with the kids in my class, and it's one thing, by the way, I want to say. You and I talk about nut picking on our other podcast. straw man fallacy has run amok in our world, in the world of serious scholarship. And I am tired of having to debate against straw men arguments. And I'm tired of other people debating straw men and thinking that they've done something. I want to have a serious and honest and fair argument. And I'll tell you, it's pretty hard to do a straw man of your opponent when you play videos of them. And Ayn Rand has a very lengthy interview with Mike Wallace when, and obviously Mike Wallace was, younger then than Chris Wallace is now by quite a bit. And so this was a very long time ago. And yet, when she says this, that virtue is being worthy of love, and talks about this notion of the virtue of selfishness, and really having the notion that one would ever love someone sacrificially and unconditionally, she viewed it as just reprehensible. And because I think it is so core to Christian doctrine and Christian life, I would think somebody like yourself in your Catholic tradition, someone like me who has serious commitments to Christian faith, I can't adopt an economic ideology that tells me that I'm supposed to mock that which is the ethos of the Christian spirit. But the good news is that upon further inquiry, I found out that markets do not require me to adopt Randianism, and in fact, require me not to. That markets can't sustain themselves with that belief, that markets can only be sustained by the ongoing efforts of moral formation that are necessary in civil society, with strong institutions, with strong families, with a high regard for personal character and individual responsibility. So, you mentioned your first influence getting to Acton, whether it is in your first year, second year, or even now. What would be an example of something that, upon being introduced to this ideological, or philosophical is a better word, this philosophical orientation to markets that struck you, that stuck with you, that was somewhat unexpected and yet profound?
Well, I guess, and this is even pre-Acton, a friend of ours, yours and mine, Steve Greenhut, introduced me to Leonard Reed, not Lawrence Reed, the current head of the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE, F-E-E. Leonard Reed wrote the essay I Pencil. And a lot of your listeners may already know about this essay. If they don't, really, I recommend checking it out. But Steve gave me a copy of it, and it's a short little thing. And it's I Pencil purports to be the autobiography of a pencil, and its whole point is to describe the uncountable inputs in a product as simple as a pencil, and that no single human being today could very likely, maybe outside of some real amazing artisan who's on a National Endowment for the Humanities or Arts grant or something, and could, find graphite, find the little metal thing for the band at the top, and the wood and the rubber from Malaysia or whatever. But that it's the guy with a chainsaw who chops down a tree in the Northwest. Where does the chainsaw come from? Where do his clothes come from? Where does he eat his lunch or his breakfast? Who supplies him with that? How do they know that he's going to need that? Who finds the graphite? Who mines it? Who brings it to market? And this decision tree, if you will, or this, maybe it's a virtuous action tree, just spreads out infinitely. And that in some ways, I think in reading that the first time, it was probably the 2010s, I remember thinking this was the spiritual dynamic that I found missing in capitalism, that I thought wasn't there, that I saw in these very romantic notions of people in 1917 thronging the streets of, Moscow and St. Petersburg, or in Havana, as Fidel marches in. That seemed very romantic to me. I used to, when you play that parlor game of where would you be at any time in history, when I was a commie, I used to say I'd want to be in Moscow in 1917 and no later. That it's just that charisma of the moment of people coming together. Well, when I read I Pencil, I suddenly realize like this happens all the time in capitalism. I drive to a Del Taco because my daughter wants to go there. And there's a person in there making food, and somebody grew the food, and somebody drove the food to this market, and somebody built the store. Somebody built the car that we're in. My employer gave me a paycheck so that I could buy it. And I find that wonderfully romantic, that people every day show up and do their jobs. And because they do, they're allowed to flourish. I flourish. That markets emerge wherever two people are gathered. That there's something really reverential about the individual, that all work is labor. This was a thing my parents drilled into me as a child. They drilled it into me. They displayed it. They were kind to other people who served them and whom they served. So that provided the first sort of initial burst. And as I've gone to Acton, I found like, oh my gosh, people have known this for, hundreds of years. You could start, I guess, with Adam Smith. But most recently in this week, I sat in on Lawrence Reed, the Leonard Reed's successor in that organization. And he talked about the Austrian School of Economics. And I know, because I listened to the Capitol Record, I know that you just discussed this last week. But I am fascinated by the fact of an insight there. And I talked to you a little bit about this when we were both out there. Just some of the key insights of the Austrian school. One of them is that you must start your economic analysis with the individual and what the individual is likely to do, rather than abstractions of classes or groups or nations or markets, that you start with what an individual might do. Its emphasis, in other words, on the individual person was revolutionary in its time, and something that I really only truly appreciated after I, did this iPencil sort of deep dive. And I don't know if I'm making any sense here, David, but it struck me suddenly sitting there this past Tuesday that this is the source of Christian faith, that each one of us, and I don't know if I'm getting too Hallmarkian here in my religious talk, so stop me if I am, but my sense is that all of this suddenly lined up this week for me. Like, oh yeah, the being a Catholic, I still have this immense affection and admiration for the Protestant Reformation, which was trying to clear away some of the authorities, and some of them bogus authorities, and some of them very violent authorities, and very political and crassly self-interested imperial policies that told the everybody else. You got a few leaders telling everybody else, this is how you believe, this is how you interpret this, and it always affirmed their own position of political power, social power. And the Protestant Reformation comes along and says, no, the individual needs to be able to read this thing for him or herself. And it doesn't discard tradition at all. That's the misnomer we Catholics sometimes, in my case, that I grew up with, that it had no regard for tradition. And I now know, of course, that's not true at all. But I know I'm wandering around here a bit, David, so rescue me. But my point is that there's this intense focus on the primacy of the individual in some respects, and his or her uniqueness in the universe, and their unique set of capacities and their potential, that the Austrian School of Economics, which I knew very little about at the beginning of the week, that school identified as really critical to any analysis. What would an individual acting along the lines of natural law, what would that person do in a market? And that markets, as Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is among you, wherever two are gathered, et cetera, that markets emerge as soon as you have two people.
Leftist teachers and administrators are indoctrinating the next generation. That's why the conservative student in your life needs Young America's Foundation. Currently enrolled students aged 13 and older can apply for YAF's individual membership program and connect with like-minded students, learn from leaders of the conservative movement, gain skills and materials to advance their ideas, and much, much more. Apply today at www.yaf.org and receive a free membership pack. Again, that's www.yaf.org for currently enrolled students. Please check it out.
But it's interesting. I think that you identified a hole in Austrian economics in that they didn't actually add the component of the ethical framework. and nor did they require, or nor did they add the intrinsic dignity of mankind. That is key to what you're saying. They did rightly identify the activity as central to economics. They did rightly identify the individuality and the kind of core function of a market being human action and it not being imposed by an external force. So there was this sort of logic of human action out of the Austrian school that was very important into the development of economic thought, including my own. Yet it actually didn't ever square that circle in terms of why these things are, let alone how glorious they are when they are attached to an anthropology that says man was made by God, imago Dei, for this reason, with these attributes that you've described. But let's bring it back to this economic thing a little bit. I wonder, what you described was sort of the invisible hand dynamic, right? That you go and then the person has to feed you, and then their suppliers are participating, and there's this kind of web of economic activity that is all integrated, and yet all at once a lot of people are having needs met and achieving a certain degree of profits and satisfactions, and it's all kind of simultaneous and immediate and a miracle of markets and what Adam Smith called the invisible hand. Are you comfortable with the other piece he said about it, which is that it was not by the benevolence of the butcher, baker, brewer we get our dinner, but by the self-interest of these folks? How hard of a tension is that for you, that there is a sort of enlightened self-interest that by trying to advance our own case through the meeting of other people's needs, that there is this sort of moral context to advancement in markets from Adam Smith versus the virtue of selfishness in Ayn Rand? Does the tension between Smith and Rand bother you at all?
Boy, that's a great question. And I feel like you've just dug a hole and covered it with leaves, and I'm going to walk into it. But I'll say this. The thing that struck me about the virtue of selfishness, which I read as a 17-year-old high school senior on my own because I've got mononucleosis and I'm stuck in bed, and I find this book on my dad's philosophy shelf, which I don't know if he'd ever read it, next to things like, Kant and Schleiermacher. My dad was a big philosophy reader. The thing that struck me was that selfishness is inherent in people, that's self-interest. Selfishness is, I think, a provocative term, and I think Rand was sometimes just being provocative. She liked that role. I don't claim to know her work or her mind that well, maybe better than most, but a lot worse than many. So I think that she was being somewhat of a propagandist and a provocateur when she talks about selfishness less than this inbuilt desire. We are built this way. We are built to take care of ourselves so that we can take care of others. I don't think she has that corollary so that we can take care of others.
No, but I also do. I also think that she's describing something different than what Smith was.
Okay, tell me. I
don't. I think that greed. That this is not semantics. I think that greed is a sin. I think that greed is a moral shortcoming, and it comes from a callous disregard of the needs of my neighbor. And the idea that greed is self-limiting because of pragmatic concerns, like I wouldn't want someone being greedy with me, so therefore I won't be greedy, and these other kind of just absurd pharisaical moral impositions that atheists add to their own ethical restraint for no reason, is obviously untrue, because if you simply say, I will avoid it catching up to me by not getting caught, or by being smarter than, like a good Darwinian, by outsmarting the other person so that my greed will help me and their greed will not hurt me. It's simple enough. Now they could fail in it, but I'm saying they could overcome that concern by just being a really more aggressive and intelligent greedy person. But I think that Smith put a limiting principle on self-interest, and I do believe that the great American political philosopher Edmund Burke colored it in even better. But I think Smith, as a byproduct of the Scottish Enlightenment, and this has become cliche in our world of economics, but you really have to read Theory of Moral Sentiments and Wealth of Nations as one book, not as two books, because I think he juxtaposes it where there is this enlightened understanding of self-interest that allows for the meeting of human needs as a driver, where Rand mocks that. And so I view greed and self-interest as not one being more provocative version of the other, but one being totally different from another, from the other.
So, yeah, and I see your point completely. I accept it. I wonder, I don't know how to say this, but isn't it possible that almost every virtue can be corrupted into a sin?
Into a vice.
Yes. And so it's important to have self-regard, but that can turn into arrogance and pride. It's important to work hard, but this can turn into a kind of workaholism, we like to call it in pop culture, so that you ignore everybody else to the fulfillment of your deep need to work. So almost anything that's good can be turned into something terrible. And I think so that, yeah, I see your point. These are two very different classes of things, but I could imagine how they are so closely related that they're often confused. And in the popular culture, I think they are confused. You confuse somebody who is, and I'll just say this, I hope you don't mind me praising you in public, but I'll say you're a guy who works very, very hard. And yet this morning I happen to know that you did a very paternal thing for your daughter. Despite the crush of time, you still did it. You're a supporter of many, many organizations out there, including CPC, California Policy Center, the Acton Institute, King's College, National Review. That's not Gordon Gekko, and yet you operate in the environment where Gordon Gekko is kind of iconic if you're on the left, the greed is good thing. So
did you watch that movie, Wall Street?
I did, but it was when it came out. Yeah.
Did you enjoy it, or you don't remember?
I didn't like it. Yeah, I just found the people repellent. There were very few redeeming characters.
See, I think that's what makes for good TV cinema, is showing the underbelly of human race in artistic form. We do not need any other movies lying to us about human nature. But you know what is a tragedy? It sounds like you haven't seen the movie since '87, so it's been 35 years. I've seen it over 100 times and have it basically memorized. The tragedy is that speech that is so famous is his line about greed is good, is the famous part, and it's the repellent part. And yet there are other parts of that same speech that were just indisputably true, critiquing basically his point was, I have a greedy motive, but look at what I'm blowing up here. I'm coming in and as an activist to this company that is so much waste and so much sloth and so much inefficiency, and I'm doing good by others out of my greedy motive. And he was rightly critiquing the corporate fat. And that's what really gave way to a lot of these takeovers and corporate raiders in the 80s, is that there were so many people in the C-suite of American companies that were resting on their laurels. They weren't adding value. They weren't creating wealth. They were lazy, and they were living off of the perks of the position. And yet, unfortunately, Gekko had to throw in this Randian tweak to it that undermined what was otherwise a somewhat salient point.
Well, and I think, again, it's a little bit just to be provocative, perhaps. I don't know. But yeah, I wonder, would you mind if we just go back to the Acton Institute and something we both heard and were wowed by? Amity Schlay's talk one night this week. You can maybe fill in a blank here and tell people who she is, but because I want to talk about Walter Reuther and her story about him. Do you want to just describe who she is?
So we've had Amity on Capitol Record before, and Amity is very likely familiar to those of you listening as the economic historian and savant that she is. I think in 20th century economic history, she's unparalleled, from the New Deal through the Great Society, and her presidential biographical skills with Coolidge she's just a treasure, a national treasure. And so Will and I heard her give one of the dinner keynote addresses this week, where she walked through the life of the founder of the UAW, United Auto Workers Union, and really shared the tragedy that was him helping auto workers by essentially laying the path to that industry's destruction. I'll let you color in more, Will.
You and I talked just a short time ago about this, and I was just really entranced by her story about how Walter Reuther in 19, I think it's 62, brings a young Tom Hayden and a bunch of other political activist college kids to the United Auto Workers summer camp, which is this kind of Scandinavian utopia that Reuther has set up for auto workers, very much on the commie model, where they used to take them down to the Black Sea and that sort of thing to summer and then send them back to a factory to live a life in hell. But I think what's fascinating that you and I didn't talk about, and that I'm really intrigued by, is that I wonder if you can help me put this back together again, but it's the capitulation of the folks at the Ford Motor Company in particular, all the way up to, was it Henry Ford Jr.?
The second, yes.
Second, thank you. Yeah. Who's running Ford as Walter Reuther comes along and capitulates, does not see what's coming. And in signing off on labor agreements with Reuther, who he comes to regard almost as a kind of a partner, as we like to say on the left, a stakeholder, and doesn't seem to have the foresight in the early 60s to realize what he's really doing is nailing his own, putting together his own coffin and then handing Reuther the pistol that's going to destroy the entire company almost, just really bring down Detroit. And I think that unwillingness, as you call it, of the C-suite class to recognize principle and to start to make little carve-outs that seem innocent enough in the beginning and then lead to the wholesale destruction of an entire industry. You and I, being both from Orange County, have just watched, I don't know if you've talked about it on your show yet, but the rise and fall of Anaheim, thanks in part to the Disney Corporation, which has really run politics in that city for a long, long time. And ultimately, what was revealed was just this viper's pit. And I don't mean to sound religious in saying that, just a basket of snakes of so-called conservatives working with so-called business people to create an environment in which corruption just flourished. And it happened among some of our friends that they became wound up around that whole issue and just they mistook, as you put it so well to me a little while ago, that, can you repeat the joke that you ask? Maybe I'll get it right. Do you remember what I'm talking about? It's that when you ask people, do you support business? And if they can tell you, if they say yes, you say which one. And if they can name one, then they're not really, yes.
Yeah.
They're not for markets.
That's right.
They're for crony capitalism.
Yeah, and what was throwing me off is I don't really think of it as a joke. I think of it as sort of a test, right? I know what you mean.
Well, it made me laugh.
And I think that's exactly right. And it's interesting. People could make two mistakes here. There is the mistake you're identifying, which is they go, what's your problem in Anaheim? If you're pro markets, why wouldn't you have been on the side of Disney? And we've spent a lot of time on Capitol Record going after cronyism. I had Michael Munger from Duke University. I've had Kenan Spivak, who's one of the great guys in DEI, and showing out the cronyist tendencies in this diversity, equity, inclusion movement. I've talked with Sam Gregg, Jay Richards, Father Sirico. Cronyism is something that we go after a whole tooth and nail here. So there's people that can make that confusion, but it's funny because you started off talking about the unions. And I think on the other side of the coin, there people could say, well, wait, you said you want to help the poor. You said you want to help the underprivileged. You said you're not just about the big guy. The unions were there to help the laborers. What's your problem? Why wouldn't you be for the unions seeking to help rationalize a fair wage? And so in both cases, what you have are people misidentifying the intent into the effect, not seeing that there was something that broke down. I believe private labor unions started. First of all, I said private, and I said started. I believe private labor unions started to counter what was an inequity in the workforce, working conditions, primarily from my understanding of the history, even before assembly lines with coal miners. And I believe there were medical, physical, health, wellness, welfare, safety reasons that some unionization could produce some leverage and some needed representation that had a purpose. I think that what they ended up being was destructive to their own cause, unreasonable, power hungry, ineffective, and ultimately, when they decided that the betterment of the organization was not their problem, the betterment of customers and the facilitation of profits was not their problem, they bought into a narrative that is inherently Marxian, which is the capital and labor at war. And the one thing I believe in is a virtuous cycle between capital and labor. Capital wants labor happy because it generates more capital, and labor wants capital happy because it generates more labor. Rinse and repeat. And do you get the fruits of labor on the capital side and properly ordered? And do you get potentially the fruits of capital properly ordered from the labor side? You most certainly do, should, can, etc. So I don't buy the tension that capital and labor necessarily function in. But the unions not only bought it, they fed it, and did so to their own demise in the American airline industry, auto industry, etc. So I don't know. It's interesting, though, in both your examples, unions and cronyism, how people could be surprised at our conclusions based on our premises, and how sometimes the premise does not go to the conclusion as easily as people think. Validity in logical form and syllogism still matters, and cogency, the truth of premises and the way we move from premise to conclusion, still matters. I was so cool in junior high when I was taking logic classes. The chicks love that kind of thing. I'm not kidding.
It's the way to attract girls. I wonder, one of what I'm really interested in Amity's recap of this whole slide of Detroit as really kind of foundational to understanding how unions operate is you always talk about the limiting principle. There is no limiting principle when you can sit at the table with a CEO, a guy like Ford, and he's willingly capitulating does not have the information apparently or the foresight to see that signing off on these deals will ultimately make his cars much more expensive and therefore not quite competitive. And she ends with this really eerie image of, all these guys in Detroit missing the arrival in like 1970, 72 in San Francisco, at the port of San Francisco, of the first Toyota Corollas rolling off a cargo ship. And that would completely just crush Detroit in the 80s and 90s. And then we get the Rust Belt. And people say, well, it's because corporate capitalism, doesn't work and the capitalists are greedy. And that's certainly what I heard from my friends on the left. And because of, our relationship, that my real, I guess, antagonism is probably not too strong a word, is for public sector unions, those in California, which we have, I've said this before, but we have 12% of the country's population here in California and 25% of its government union members. They generate about $900 million per year. And all of that goes to political organizing, whether it's for a local contract or statewide initiatives or backing candidates, whatever it is, that's where the money goes. And these guys control state government in California, which is why we have a lopsided and dysfunctional state house. And part of the problem here is that nobody is sitting opposite from the labor leader in the government context with anything like a limiting principle. So the government unions elect a candidate, he or she gets into office and then signs off on anything that government union wants: better, higher pay, better benefits packages. And unlike Ford, there's no apocalypse, there's no hell, there's no bankruptcy, really, because the state simply turns around, even at the local level, cities, counties, school districts, simply turn around and raise taxes. And so there's nobody there to say, hey, we can't afford this. And if we pay it, we're going to get beat by some, faster, nimbler competitor. And in California, this leads to just absolute corruption. We have this legal corruption at the heart of our political system that is the government union. And so going back to the private sector for a sec, one of the things that struck me this week was listening to a conversation about how the C-suite class has been taken over by something that I know you've talked about on this show before. I'm a listener. And that's the divestment equity stuff and inclusion stuff. This is now the mindset of so many major corporations. And one of the things that came up at the Acton Institute this week was a guy who leads trainings in, what did he call it? Shoot, I have it in my notes somewhere. Commonality training, basically. Instead of diversity training, commonality training. Because we all start as human beings trapped in our own consciousness, inherently, as you and I have been talking about, with this kind of self-regard, this concern for our own survival. So we start off with a sense of permanent uniqueness, if you will. We're just thrown into this world thinking, I'm all alone in a crowd of people. What am I? Who am I? I better look out for myself because nobody else is. And diversity training exacerbates and amplifies that uniqueness. It does not build team. So how do you overcome that human problem? You don't amplify it. You don't produce more wind behind its sails and help it become more important. You have to work on commonality training. And so he was talking about how the C-suite really ought to be emphasizing team building, teamwork, team spirit. And I just, again, it seems like such an obvious idea. Team building in the workplace is mocked in so many places, whether it's the TV series, which is awesome, The Office, or the movie Office Space, where team building is just a front. It's a facade for exploitation. But what would happen if it were driven by a moral executive managerial class that really understood that their fate is tied with their workers and their workers becoming better and becoming more valuable and possibly even, yes, moving on to better opportunities? That commonality training of how do we work as a team to produce something. I was talking to one of your friends at Pacifica Christian High School who told me that he's really looking for people who can work with others on the team to satisfy a mission. And if they can't, no offense taken or intended, they're not right for the job. And that's certainly how I feel about, my organization, the California Policy Center. I know it's how you feel about yours. But this idea of commonality training, of team building, of building that sharpening that virtuous impulse of personal responsibility into something that can contribute to a team. That seems really obvious.
Well, listen, Will, we could sit here and talk about all these different issues and the derivative topics they bring up for another hour, but we should probably let people go. And then hopefully we've just tantalized them so much that they go, I got to hear these two together on Radio Free California. But I do need to tell them that if they come to Radio Free California, they will find a far more organized format, a real command control leadership from Will Swaim. And if they come back to Capitol Record, they will get more of this, which is the beliefs that Will and I have shared today, a passion for the free society, a desire to see a better life for the impoverished, and a respect for the confines of liberty and ethical restraint that help make flourishing possible. Will, thanks for being a part of my journey. It's a blessing to be part of yours. Let's keep doing this stuff.
Well, people who listen to this show will know that this is what happens on Radio Free California too, that you teach me. So thank you for that. It's been going on for years now, and I'm really grateful.
All right, my friend. Very nice of you to say. And with that, thank you all for listening to another episode of Capitol Record. We truly do appreciate your ongoing listening, and we would love for you to subscribe, to give us a bunch of stars, ratings, reviews, forward, share, whatever it is. Help spread the word as we continue in our efforts to promote a free and virtuous society. Thank you for listening to the Capitol Record.